Hi everyone, today I will be demonstrating my process for a landscape painting without any initial ideation. I hope you will find this video informative. I use abstraction throughout my whole process. I find it allows for a spontaneous and organic painting experience. If you are new to digital art, you may find a more methodical approach to digital painting to be easier to understand and more beneficial to you. This abstraction process involves a thorough understanding of your fundamentals. As such, this video is more for intermediate and above artists. At this stage, I have no clear idea of what I want to paint, other than knowing I want to make a landscape. I initially start my paintings with an open-ended goal of creating some interesting shapes and textures. Whilst I do this, I look for interesting shape interactions to try and start an idea I can run with. I initially start my paintings with a gradient of colour that is usually made up of the tone I wish to use for the sky and the ground plane. I select my colour scheme essentially at this stage, as I will often pick colours that fit with this gradient, so it is important to get it right as it influences the rest of the painting. I use a textured custom brush and start with some basic large random brush strokes, just to get some textures and forms on the canvas. I begin to paint some colour variation and use the tone of the sky and light to try and establish some recognisable forms. I use transform, the one tool, layers, brush strokes and copy merge selections to continue my goal of creating interesting shape and texture interactions, which will hopefully lead to an idea forming. I quite like the way the shapes and colours are interacting in a circled area, and so I use the copy merge selection to take some of the shapes to use elsewhere in the painting. Here I am suggesting a top plane to try and extract some forms I see from the texture. I further establish some forms and add a bit of depth by using a gradient with no fill to add some atmospheric perspective. It can look quite messy at this stage, so I just have to trust the process. Here I start creating areas of increased information density around potential focal points, and I start introducing some more colour variations using the one tool and colour balance. At this point I am starting to get an idea for some sort of a mountain environment, perhaps with a water feature. At this stage I start establishing clearer shapes and forms. I also save a texture and shape that I like for potential use for later on. I am establishing the skyline and separating out the background and middle ground. The landscape starts to become clearer to see at this point. I will occasionally zoom out. This allows me to see if my shapes are reading clearly. Here I am using a copy merge selection and colour balance to establish a flat ground plane with a unified colour scheme. I now begin painting in the water. I first paint over the areas I want the water with the tone I have used for the sky. I lower the opacity here to show the texture underneath. This gives the water its initial translucent look. I am using pixel lock on the water layer to add some colour variations to the water without affecting the surrounding area. Next I paint in some suggestions of shadow and form. I use the curves tool to add some contrast. I further refine the shapes in the middle ground and background. I use a combination of painting, transform tools and a lasso tool to do this. As you can see, I zoom out again to make sure everything is reading clearly. I noticed a nice shape / texture which would make for a great sandbank. Much of the painting process involves looking for these interesting shapes and seeing how I can use them throughout my painting. Here is a technique I worked out recently to create clouds. First I copy merge select an area of the painting that I like the shape of for the cloud. Then I apply the medium filter to it, remove all the detail and leaving just the overall shape. I then use the gradient tools and paint to establish the forms. Using this technique allows for the shapes I wouldn't have necessarily come up with had I painted it directly. After this I desaturate so that it is mostly grayscale. The subtle colour variation leads to a more vibrant look. I repeat the process to create some more clouds. Remember to paint the clouds with perspective and foreground to background depth in mind. Here I have begun to further emphasize the focal points using contrast. Losing the edge of the cloud and having a bright sand against a darker rock is one of the ways you can do this. Copy merge techniques like the ones I'm using tend to lead to a build-up of artifacts outside of the canvas. Use the crop tool once in a while to delete these, as it's just more information for Photoshop to load, which can slow it down. I add depth and shape clarity by using local atmospheric perspective. I select a colour in the local area of the shape, for example the green in the water, and increase the value. Then I use a gradient to no fill tool on the edge of the section. This causes the effect of pushing everything behind the shape back and allowing a selected shape to be more clearly defined. I add more contrast to the overall painting by copy merge selecting the entire painting, then desaturating the painting. I use the curves and levels tools to emphasize the shapes and textures in the painting, being careful not to make everything too dark or too white, aiming for a clear but high contrast. I then change the layer to soft light and play around with the opacity of the layer until I am happy with the result. You can also use hard light and overlay for this effect. I find soft light works best for more subtle effects. Here I am pushing back the background mountains a little more using a sky tone. The further something is away from you, the more of the atmosphere colour it will pick up. Here I am checking the composition. You can use the crop tool to see a grid. There are different grids available to use. Generally, the closer the focal point is to the intersecting lines, the more visually appealing your composition will be. Try to keep the elements of the painting away from the edges. The goal is to keep the viewer's eye moving around the painting and not leaving the canvas. I move the beach in layer over to the left so it's closer to the focal point. Doing this leads to an interesting artifact forming. I end up using this to add some detail to the background. Around the half-hour point I usually have enough of the painting established to know if I want to take it to a finish or not. This is a great point to stop if you want to do a sketch or to use this painting for a thumbnail. If you're doing this as a day's work, you could conceivably do 8 30-minute sketches, then spend the afternoon taking the painting to a high level of finish. This painting technique is great for establishing thumbnails as demonstrated here. You can simply shrink the painting down, which will have the added benefit of making it look more finished. And then you can either start a new painting, or as shown here you can paint over your painting to create a variation. Generally I try not to spend more than an hour on a painting like this. My goal is to establish the mood, composition, lighting, overall colour scheme and essentially have everything in place that clearly communicates my idea to the client. Here I am using a smudge tool to create some interesting shape variations. You can quickly create an entirely new landscape in this manner. I tend to use a mix of drawing and painting to help quickly indicate forms for a painting like this. Here I am going in and indicating the shapes of the mountain, which helps with readability. Once this is done, if you want to take it to a finish, it's just a case of going back in and rendering out the shape that is now clearly indicated. Here I am improving the composition by adding a foreground element that leads into the painting. It also makes for an interesting double inlet look to the coast. Later I further define the forms of the background mountains using a warm shadow to contrast the cool tone of the sky. I use a technique where I copy merge the whole painting and apply a medium filter. Then lower the opacity of the layer. This softens all the shapes and gives a more organic painterly look. Here I merged all the layers. This is primarily due to the toll the recording software can take on Photoshop. In general, I do like to keep my layer count low as it helps keep the layers organised. Both of the clouds are occupying the midground of the painting. In order to create more depth, I move the right hand cloud into the background. I further add depth to the painting by painting a cloud that recedes into the background from the midground and floats above the other clouds. It is important to remember that your clouds should conform to perspective and to think about how they fit into the environment. This will avoid them having a cartoon-like flat appearance and will help give your painting a high level of depth. Lastly, I further emphasise the lighting and contrast around the focal points using a colour dodge technique. First I copy merge the whole painting, then using brush mode colour dodge with a grey tone, I paint over the areas of the painting that I want to be brighter. I am careful not to use this too much as it will create a burned look. I also add some suggestion of the light and a bit of reflection from the mountain. A bit later I then extend the canvas out slightly to help the composition breathe more and add a point of interest to the midground. If you are wondering, I tend to paint everything myself rather than use Photoshop's new AI extension tool, as I feel I get the results I want quicker. And the AI tool tends to add too much detail to the corner of the canvas, which is something you should always try to avoid as it leads the viewer out of the composition. Here I put a uniform colour in the background that matches the environment. The white that was there from the extension makes the extended area feel separate from the rest of the painting. Here I put a uniform colour as an underpainting in the background. The white that was there for the extension makes the extended area feel separate from the rest of the painting. I create the point of interest by using the copy merge technique with the medium filter and some painting. The placement of the midground point of interest, along with the foreground sandbank and the curve of the beach, creates a focal point which causes the viewer to continue looking towards the middle of the canvas where all the main points of interest are. I move the point of interest closer to the intersection of the grid to improve the composition. I have also enlarged one of the rocks to create some hierarchy which increases visual interest of the object. Here I use a selection of the sandbank to add texture and interest to the background. I always try to save time in painting by taking sections of my painting and using them elsewhere. Usually with a bit more painting on top, I can create something that looks detailed but not repetitive. I am suggesting rocks and detail here by using a simple squiggle line shape. I will go in later and render this out if I were to take it to a finish. At this stage of the painting, my goal is to suggest detail and to give a first impression of completion. For the last few minutes of my first hour, I focused on defining the shapes and ensuring everything has a clear read. Once I feel the painting communicates my intent clearly, and all that is left to do is continue the rendering and the painting, I will either call it finished and move on to a new painting, or I will continue on the current painting. I tried to spend the first 4 hours establishing all of the main points of interest clearly, suggesting all of the textures and lighting, and basically making the painting look finished rather than like a loose sketch. I continued painting for another hour. Unfortunately, Photoshop's second window wasn't updating, so recording is a little jumpy. I spend most of the time further defining forms, rendering and cleaning up the loose brush strokes. I duplicated the whole painting, then used a desaturated difference clouds filter with a soft light layer on my rocks to give them a soft subtle texture. Sometimes I copy, merge and enlarge an area to paint it. Afterwards I'll shrink it back down. This creates an area of high resolution detail. I ended up adding a cast shadow from the background mountains with the goal of creating a strong contrast with the focal areas and a more dramatic lighting scheme. Here is the final sketch. From this stage the painting will become more detailed and refined, but the main elements that you see here will likely stay the same. I've painted for another 2 hours or so at this point. I added some more clouds and moved them around to add more depth to the sky. For points of interest I've added a waterfall off to the side in the background. I also wanted to add more movement to the landscape, and I wanted to break up the predominantly rock environment so it wasn't repetitive, so I've added the waves coming in and washing over the rocks. I hope you found this process video informative. Thanks for watching.